here's a point where I think we could give a check mark beside some of the discussion with Jonathan Pageau. He gets it right here. There is a parallel between Abraham's wife being taken by Pharaoh and the Egyptian king here taking away people and subjugating. Snake right here, like right here. It was a sign of divine power.
It can be the Hebrew midwives or the midwives of the Hebrews. There is no possible way, based on those two words, to know which it is.
Again, this is where having someone who works in biblical studies might have helped here. Yes, that phrase is ambiguous, but there's actually other context that could help fill this in.
Hey everyone, this is What Your Pastor Didn't Tell You. Today I'm on with Dr. Joel Korytko. We're going to be talking about Jordan Peterson's new series called The Exodus. First of all, Joel Korytko, he is an Old Testament scholar. He is specifically an expert on the Exodus. So this will be great to hear his commentary on it. Some notes before we begin though. We're going to talk about just general thoughts about the series so far. Not going to go through, literally every single quote of the series. We're also going to be including clips from the YouTube. We're not going to include the entire video because obviously copyright reasons. Joel, can you talk about just what we're doing in this video?
Yeah, thanks for the introduction, Zach. And this is going to be fun. First off, we're just going to have some fun looking at what is a really interesting discussion, to say the least, on Exodus. And there's a couple things we need to make sure that we're not doing, and we're kind of outright stating that we're not doing from the start. And what we're not doing is we're not here to bash Jordan Peterson and his crew of people who are working through this book together. We're also definitely not claiming, and I'm specifically not claiming to be an evolutionary biologist, or psychologist, philosopher. There's some philosophers they have on there. I'm not a best-selling author. I think one's a relic craftsman. And I don't really know what Dennis Prager is, but I'm not that. We're not that. We're not trying to be that. We are particularly approaching this conversation from an angle of biblical studies, and specifically asking if somebody were at this round table who worked in biblical studies and in the discipline of biblical studies, what might it have looked like? Because now. It might not be apparent to everyone who sees a clip or watches the Exodus round table. There aren't actually any biblical scholars there. So there are people who are philosophers. There are evolutionary psychologists. I don't think, does Dennis Prager have a biblical studies degree? I don't think he does. No, yeah. Nope. And so it part of what we're doing here is kind of making aware and making you all aware of kind of some of the pitfalls and shortcomings of those who might not be aware of the broader discussions going on in biblical studies concerning the topics that they speak about. And so that's going to become apparent as we work through these through their comments. And that's kind of the point of this video is, hey, what does it look like for biblical studies to be introduced into this discussion, because it's just not there. And I think a lot of the weaknesses kind of become apparent. So we're not bashing them again, but it is a bit of a critique saying, why wasn't somebody there who could push back on some of this and kind of get to a closer, in biblical studies, you usually use the term, the hermeneutical spiral. And so you're working towards meaning. You're taking, you're using different checks and balances to bring you into a closer and closer honing in on what this text might be getting at. And that's just lacking in this video. They don't use checks and balances. They just kind of take a word or an item and they jump off from it. And so we're trying to kind of hone it in, and no one's got the monopoly on a meaning of a text. I'm not claiming to have a monopoly on the meaning of the text, but rather there are these tools and there are discussions that have been going on for a long time. And if we could bring those in, we could maybe rein in some of the comments that are going on. And so that's kind of the point of what we're doing here.
Right. Yeah, totally appreciate that. Okay. So for anyone who's just not really care about the commentary, but just wants to know our thoughts to begin with. So my thoughts are they all have great voices. Definitely makes things interesting to, listen to all their different range of voices.
The fear of God, the Hebrew proper fear.
It's not really someone for, in my opinion, at least, this is not for someone that, attempting to learn more about the Bible. The things they talk about are, very basic. Which would make this conversation more interesting between me and you, Dr. Korytko. This is great for people. The series is great for people that if they're looking to learn more about morality and social issues related to the Exodus story. It's really interesting in that regard. And they ask a lot of life's greatest questions, which makes things really fascinating.
No, yeah, I agree. And a lot of the things they say about life in general, like you said, are really good points, right? Uh, I don't want to bash Jordan's and others' approach to responsibility. Having something, taking the first step in your life towards taking a greater control of it and having more responsibility. There's that the clean your room joke that goes around. Like that's fine and good, and I'm not against that. We're kind of focusing in on one thing, right? But so all that message, that's good. That I don't have a problem with that.
Cool. All right. So just to start it off, the first 10 minutes of the first part of the video is just introducing the speakers. And I'll just list the names for we got. Obviously, Jordan Peterson, Douglas Hedley, Oz Guinness, James Orr, Dennis Prager, Stephen Blackwood, and Jonathan Pageau. Did I pronounce that right?
Yeah.
Pageau. Pageau. And Jonathan Pageau. And so, as Dr. Korytko just mentioned, Dennis Prager is actually the only one that knows Hebrew on it, which makes things interesting as he adds his commentary in it. Some of them have degrees in theology and philosophy, but none of them really have degrees in Old Testament or the Exodus. So this will make things really interesting getting Korytko's thoughts. I want to add though that Peterson, he says that he calls these scholars, this entire little series to help him form his thoughts before he goes and talks about his own lecture series, kind of like he did with Genesis discussion and the book of Genesis. Right. So just to start out, and after they go through the intro, Peterson, he talks about Exodus as a story of priority structure with God on top, and then a story about freedom from tyranny even if he pulls you into the desert. And they read Exodus 1:1-7, where it talks about picking up where Genesis left off, or the Joseph and the brothers had all died. Israelites as a group, they got bigger, and they're in Egypt. At minute 14, Prager says, Pharaoh didn't know Joseph. He talks about how the verse is super popular, and it can be applied today with how people in America forget how we are. They talk about Exodus 1:8-10, where Pharaoh sees Israelites are too big of a people. They must do something to stop this, basically. Peterson makes statements about how Egyptians, they don't really trust the Israelites. And then they read Exodus 1:11, where Pharaoh makes the Israelites slaves. And then Peterson makes a claim about the negative betrayal of the subjugation of the Israelites, implying that the text condemns slavery. What do you think about that?
Yeah. You said commends, I think, accidentally. He doesn't commend it. He condemns it.
Oh,
yeah.
Nice.
And so,
Okay,
yeah, I mean, it's an interesting claim from Peterson, and he's seeing this very clear aspect of the story, which is that they're slaves and they shouldn't be slaves and in this situation, and that they're coming out, which, yes, that's there in the text. I think the problem with it is that Peterson makes this kind of grand application saying that, the text is implying that slavery as a whole is is a no-no, but I think that's not quite a nuanced enough of a perspective, especially since as the narrative progresses, we get to the law code at Sinai in chapter 21, and you will see aspects of slavery legislated there by God. And now I'm, of course, not making some sort of positive assertion for the practice of slavery, but what I am saying is that in the ancient world, slavery was a given. This was what happened in all their societies all around them. And so for Peterson to say that the text is kind of implicitly condemning it, whereas later on it actually it is putting constraints on it, it is assuming it. I'm not sure if he's quite right there, especially since it looks like here the problem with this slavery is its type of subjugation, in that it's this kind of backbreaking, murderous, relentless deprivation of life that's coming from the Egyptians to the Israelites, and so that's one kind of slavery. But then there's also things like debt slavery in the ancient world, where which I think is probably what they're getting at more in Exodus 21, where someone who has no means left, they say, okay, well, I'm going to sell my the right to my life in a sense, but to work for the next 6 years, and then in the seventh year they'd be freed. And so that's how they have leverage in that world when they have nothing, right? And so that's a different kind of slavery. So I think it would be helpful if you would kind of look at the rest of the book and go, oh, there's more to it than just this, and make some big statement about earlier narrative when there's clearly other things to consider, especially given the ancient Near Eastern context. So again, it's slavery was a reality in the ancient world, but the Bible is putting limitations on abusing that system. But you can't make wholesale claims just from the narrative when there's other things going on in the text that he might not be aware of.
Hey chat, subscribing to our YouTube channel allows us to help our watchers understand the Bible better. Thanks to your help, we have already reached thousands of people in their walk with Christ. If you'd like to help further our efforts, tap the subscribe button, which will allow us to reach even more people.
You forgot to tell them to turn on bell notifications.
Wait, they have to subscribe and click a bell now? Right, so the narrator of Exodus is essentially saying that, this specific type of slavery that they're doing, of subjugation, is, essentially morally wrong. And he's not saying that, slavery in general is bad, at this point at least.
Yeah, I think it's just too big of a stretch to say that that's what's being claimed because of what happens in chapter 21 and elsewhere in the Pentateuch and elsewhere in the Bible and the ancient Near East. So you could say this particular type of slavery is being condemned, but I don't know if you can make a wholesale claim like Peterson's claiming.
Gotcha. Okay. All right. So to continue, they read Exodus 1, 12 to 14, which describe how, the Israelites or the Egyptians enforced them to do slave labor. They enforced the Israelites to do, all this slavery labor type of stuff. To continue, Peterson notes how the Nazis and they enforced the Jews to slavery, essentially. Jonathan Pageau, he talks about how there's a connection between the Egyptian king and Abraham's story, and how he takes Abraham's wife, just like the Exodus Pharaoh takes the men in the Exodus story and subjugates them as a means of removing potential. Do you see like a similar parallel there in Genesis with Abraham and then the people in Exodus?
Yeah, so here's a point where I think we could give a check mark beside some of the discussion, and I think this happens the most with Jonathan Pageau, is he notes some of these kind of literary motifs that run through some of the narratives of the Pentateuch, and I think he gets it right here. There is a parallel between Abraham's wife being taken by Pharaoh and the Egyptian king here taking away people and subjugating. So that's good. I don't know if it's just about this idea of removing potential in a broad sense. I think in the narrative thrust of the Pentateuch, you've got Abraham. He gets this promise of descendants, and the descendants are going to bless the world. It's a specific seed, so a specific group of his descendants who are going to do this, who God is going to be kind of making this revelatory movement with. And so what's going on in the narrative is that this is the seed being threatened. So in the case of Abraham's wife, there's a threat to the seed. And here in Exodus, when the men, the baby boys are taken away, well, that's the seed, the promised seed, right? So it's a threat to this promise that is the through line in the Pentateuch and elsewhere. And you could even make a case for the Old Testament. And so he's right in one way. But I'm not sure if it's just this idea of completely removing potential in an abstract sense. But he's going in the right direction.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so later Peterson talks about how, and this is the specific quote, he says, it's imaged as this idea of making bricks, and it's that a reference to Babel as well, it's like this idea of wanting to be higher than God or wanting to replace God. And so we make civilization, that's what bricks are. We make civilization, and then we think that civilization replaces the highest ideal. What do you think about that?
Yeah, sometimes it's hard to follow exactly what Peterson says. He kind of goes to different places and jumps around. Here, he also talks outside of this quote a bit about instrumentality, and that people are being used in an instrumental way. And so he gets at a couple things here with respect to the instrumentality aspect. That's probably good. That's right. They are dehumanizing the Israelites here. That's what we're seeing. There actually might be a connection. So I don't think Peterson knows this, but he might kind of be stumbling upon it. A connection between the Passover and what's going on with Egyptians, and then the kind of cosmic waters of the flood. There's the destroyer, excuse me, in the Passover, and then also the destroying waters in the flood. So there might be a connection there, but if not that word, even just thematically, because the crime of the pre-flood peoples is that they were evil, but they also had this thing called Hamas, like violence. This word is often associated with theft, and some scholars argue that it's better translated as a devaluation. You can see that's how it's used later in the Sarah and Abraham story. I think it's Genesis 16. When they're arguing with Hagar, Sarah says that there's Hamas upon me, so violence upon me, and it's not really, violence doesn't make sense. It seems to be more like her devaluation of me, that I'm not a human anymore to her. And so the world in chapter 6 of Genesis, it seems to be filled with this Hamas violence, the devaluation of people's worth. And so God, he judges them. And that's what's happening in Egypt with the slavery. So I think there is a parallel there, this devaluation of life and then judgment coming upon. And so he's right there in the instrumentality. People are just objects to be used, and they're not equal to us. I think that's good. There is also a connection between Genesis 11, the Babel story, and Exodus. You can see it particularly with Exodus 1 and 5. There's this term for bricks, levanim, I believe. And that term is only used here. So these two stories. So you probably should see a connection when they say, "Come, let us make bricks" in Genesis 11, and then you've got in Exodus making these bricks, and you're probably supposed to make a quick thematic connection as you're reading the Pentateuch. So they're right here in that claim. Some people argue that the story of Babel is actually about a people group enforcing one language and enforcing this whole tower project on the whole populace. And so that'd be a good resonance with what's happening in Egypt and for why judgment is due. So they're making a good Babel-Egypt connection, I think, based on this kind of stuff. I think Pajot says that the people in the story of Babel were wanting to be higher than God. So that's the claim, wanting to be higher than God. Maybe that's where they're going astray here, though. The tower they're building, it's a ziggurat, and a ziggurat wasn't a way to get higher than a god, but it's a place for the god to make their abode. So the top of the ziggurat is where the god's going to dwell, right? And we see this all throughout the ancient Near East. You could see even the same language of reaching to the highest heaven, like getting up into the clouds. We see that in other parallel literature. So it's a common motif, and that's just where the god is dwelling, right? And so they're making a place for the god to live, and so the sin is not necessarily getting higher than God, but it's actually presuming that they had the right for the divine to live among them. They want God to be there, and they're going to do it on their own terms. And so what you need to get in the narrative thrust of the early chapters of Genesis is that this is in contrast to the Eden narrative, because Eden is portrayed as a cosmic mountain and a temple. And so Eden, the Garden of Eden, is kind of the antechamber of the temple. And then you can go out from there, and then even higher up would be kind of God's domain. And so a ziggurat mimics that. And so you've got Eden, and you've got people being kicked out and going down the mountain. And then now here in Babel, they're getting back up and presuming upon the fact that God obviously will dwell with us, even though we're an evil empire, even though we subjugate people. And so that's kind of the problem, is the assumption of God's presence, which, if you follow all the way to Exodus and into Leviticus, what is kind of the climax or the center of the Pentateuch? It's the tabernacle and the dwelling of God and God's presence returning. And it's no easy feat, right? It takes a lot of work, and it takes very specific requirements for God to dwell with people. So Babel is presuming upon that, which is kind of a big part of their problem. So it's not so much getting past God, surpassing God, but it's rather assuming God will be with us in like an anti-Eden kind of way. And so I think they've kind of missed it here, but in other ways they got it right.
Later they talk about, Prager or Peugeot talks about how Egypt represents, our own passions. It's what we think. And then Peterson says that, that which should be the highest is actually the least priority in this story. Peugeot says that making reference, you talked about that. Guinness says that Israel is judged as a second Egypt under Solomon, so that we see a parallel later in the Bible. Prager talks about, there's two tyrannies in the Torah, which is the first 5 books of the Bible, including the Exodus, where there's an external tyranny of like somewhere like Egypt, and then an internal, which is ourselves. And Peterson talks about how, is there something other than tyranny? I'm not sure what he was referring to be honest.
Yeah.
So Prager claims that the purpose of the 10 Commandments was to free from the internal tyranny. Do you have any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, it's an interesting claim, and I want to be careful here because his claim is that the 10 Commandments, quote, free from internal tyranny. And so I want to be careful because he's Jewish and I'm a Christian, and so I'll have a different perspective probably than he will on this. And so I'm going to be respectful in that way and say perhaps there's a different approach to the law and what the law's function was in his worldview. And that's fine, and that's okay. That's his worldview. But in a Christian perspective, and I'm surprised no one pushed back here, especially because there was a bunch of Christians at the table. In the Christian perspective, the law is great and good and holy and insightful, full of wisdom. But the prophetic claim, and even within the Old Testament itself, is that there's a new covenant that needs to come in that can free from the internal tyranny, right? This problem, the external following the law didn't work because there was an internal problem. They needed, you hear about a new heart. You hear about the law being written on their heart, being cleansed with water, my spirit within you. There's stuff in Ezekiel and Jeremiah, Isaiah, all of this. They talk about this need of an inner transformation. And then the claim of Jesus and of the new covenant movement in Jesus is that happens with the Spirit when the Spirit comes and indwells people. And so that would be the internal freeing from tyranny, whereas the law itself didn't seem to have that ability. Paul will say the law, weakened by the flesh, couldn't do it, right? In Romans 8. And so the Christian perspective would not be freedom from internal tyranny. But again, a Jewish perspective could argue against my claims here.
Yeah, it's a really interesting distinction there. I definitely wouldn't have thought that. It's hard to look at people and how they see it from a different context. Someone like Prager might see it completely differently than someone like in our context, a Christian perspective. So to continue, Peterson talks about how slavery, the slavery corrupts the slave as much as the slaver, in regards to how, the Pharaoh, it seems as the story goes on, it seems like he's becoming more and more corrupt. He's closing his heart off to, doing what's right. And it's corrupting him just as much as it's hurting the actual slaves in the story. So then they talk about Exodus 1:15 to 16. And this will be our first clip. So let's get into it.
When you do the office of a midwife to the Hebrew women and see them upon the birthing stools, if it be a son, then you shall kill him. And that's that instrumental usage that you were talking about before.
There is a huge issue here. The Hebrew is completely indeterminative whether the midwives were Hebrews or not. Mialdota Ivriot, and I'm not going to throw out Hebrew often. I feel very self-conscious at all. But for those who know Hebrew, they will know what I'm talking about. It can be the Hebrew midwives or the midwives of the Hebrews. There is no possible way, based on those two words, to know which it is. I am convinced, and Jewish tradition doesn't agree with me. I mean, post-biblical Jewish tradition. The Torah, I think, does agree with me, but c'est la vie. I believe they were Egyptian. I do not believe he would have ordered Hebrew midwives to murder every Hebrew boy.
Do you think there's a purposeful ambiguity there to leave it up to question?
That's beautiful. It may well be. That's right. Well, it certainly is. The Hebrew is ambiguous. That is correct.
Because, I mean, if a tyranny gets corrupt enough, then people turn against themselves.
That's right. However, just on logical grounds, when he gets angry at them for not doing it, it would be odd he'd get angry at Hebrews for not killing Hebrews. But my biggest proof you're coming to, where it says that they feared God and didn't listen to Pharaoh. Again, it's one of my favorite lines in the whole Bible. You either fear humans or you fear God. Fear God is the root of freedom and wisdom. And the word for God is not Jehovah or Yahweh, it's Elohim. So when Jews fear God, it's generally fear Yahweh, and in this case, it's fear Elohim, the universal word for God, and I am convinced that they are Egyptians.
Douglas, do you have any sense of what it means in this passage and more broadly that the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom and an appropriate, let's say, precondition for freedom? Why do you think it's conceptualized as fear?
All right. So yeah, let's talk about that. So in this Exodus story, the Pharaoh orders the Egyptian or Hebrew midwives to kill the other Hebrew children. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's the story. And so Prager's claim here, and he makes some pretty big claims, is that this is referring to Hebrew midwives. And there's a term, meyeladot, ha'ibriot. And so while he's correct based on just this phrase, so either it's midwives, Egyptian midwives of the Hebrews, or the Hebrew midwives, just because it could be either of those grammatically doesn't mean that there aren't other things that could point us towards an answer. So again, this is where having someone who works in biblical studies or who has a bit more knowledge in biblical exegesis might have helped here, because yes, that phrase is ambiguous, but there's actually other context that could help fill this in. And so if you look at the names of the midwives, you've got Shifra, which actually is a name that appears in the 18th century in a list of Egyptian slaves, and the name itself is a Northwest Semitic kind of name, like that of that language group. So not Egyptian, it's Semitic or Proto-Semitic, kind of Canaanite, Proto-Canaanite kind of thing. And it means something like beauty in Hebrew or a related dialect. And Pua is actually a name of a heroine in the Ugaritic legend of Akkad. So it probably means something like lass. And again, these are both then Semitic names. And so you wouldn't expect Egyptians to have Semitic names. Now, is that an airtight case? No. But does it point to the author saying, hey, these are meant to be taken as Hebrews because of their names? I'd say, yeah, like that's a pretty strong indicator. And there's another thing that Prager says here. He says that his biggest proof that these were Egyptian midwives is because of the term used, which is Elohim, instead of something like Yahweh. And that doesn't stand up to scrutiny, because there are a couple things to think about here. Well, first off, literarily speaking, why is God called Elohim in these first few chapters of Exodus? And you got to remember that in chapter 3, we're going to get the big name reveal of Yahweh. And the big name reveal is kind of where this is heading, this narrative. So it's a literary means of, you don't say the name Yahweh until you get to the passage in the burning bush that most people know. And so that's one thing. There's a reason why it's Elohim throughout, and it's Elohim all throughout, right up until then. And so it's not just these midwives. It's on the voice on the lips of the narrator as well. But also it's Ha Elohim, which includes the article. Now it's not always Ha Elohim. It's just Elohim can be either Ha Elohim or Elohim, depending on whether or not the term is grammatically oblique. So if it's not the subject, it'll often be Ha, just to make sure that we're talking about the God of Israel. And so, and that pretty much stands throughout Exodus, and there are little quibbles and things you could do about or talk about with respect to that, but it gives a very strong case that we're talking about the God of Israel, and that's how you would talk about the God of Israel with Ha Elohim. And so it's a bit of an issue then for Prager to say it's just indeterminate. We don't know. When there are other factors coming in here to help us understand that these are probably Hebrew midwives. And so there's more to consider than just one phrase, midwives of Hebrews, because that's not how you do exegesis. You have to take in all of the things that could inform an exegetical decision, like some of the things I've just said.
All right, awesome. All right, let's keep going.
Why do you think it's conceptualized as fear?
Well, I think there's a proper fear that in this case, I think is linked to transcendence. So there's the fear of the tyrant, which is normal and natural, and which we are all subject to. But there should be a greater fear, i.e. the fear of the transcendent
Of violating it.
Violating that,
Right,
yes.
right.
And of course, this is why the postmodern attack on traditional Western culture is so dangerous. I mean, of course, it goes back to the very origins of Western culture with the sophists, but the idea that there is no such thing as an objective moral order, and there certainly is no transcendent basis for that, that would make this whole narrative unintelligible.
It also makes the tyrant the final arbiter in some real sense, right?
It becomes justification.
You know, people have asked me, and I'm always embarrassed by this, but people have commented on my courage for speaking up, so to speak. And I think you don't actually understand the situation. I'm not courageous in my speaking up. I'm more afraid of the alternative. And part of the reason for that was that when I was a clinician and I spent thousands, tens of thousands of hours dealing with people's serious problems, one of the things I learned was, and I really learned this, was that you don't get away with anything. And so you might think you can bend the fabric of reality and that you can treat people instrumentally and that you can bow to the tyrant without and violate your conscience without cost, but that is just not the case. You will pay the piper.
Yeah, so they talked a little bit about fearing God, and and they kind of took that into what that means as far as modern terms and all that kind of stuff. Can you talk about just what would you say is your view of what it really means to fear God? Do you think they're right in that? And you also mentioned in our talks about there's kind of a reference of fearing God in the daughters. Can you talk about that too?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I mean, fearing God, Peterson is kind of equating fearing God with following your conscience. It seems like that's kind of what he was saying. Don't bow to the tyrant, follow your conscience. That's what fearing God is. Whereas I think there would be way more of a structure to what the person writing Exodus or an Israelite or even a Christian would say when it comes to fearing God, in that there is a way of Yahweh. As you hear early in Genesis, they left the way of Yahweh, and so I think there's a trajectory and a kind of moral compass that the biblical text provides in some ways, and it's not just conscience; it's redirection of conscience as well. So, and in that way, that's that's the fear of the Lord, and that you're it's like a reverence, let's say, or something like that, or a deference to the King of the universe, in which you are then following the path. And in the Christian perspective, it's the path of Jesus, right, which is the path of love and of self-sacrifice for the good of another. And so if that's what he means by conscience, then sure, but I'm not quite sure that's what he means, because oftentimes when you kind of try to drill down Peterson on, well, what do you mean by kind of going for the highest goal or the best? It's kind of nebulous. It's like, well, your best is not my best, it's not his best. So what's best, right? And that's kind of the problem with some of this. But yeah, that's just a thought on that.
Yeah, awesome. Okay, and what about the reference you've made between the sons of daughters looking upon, and how that parallels kind of with the fear of God in the story? Can you talk about that part? Uh,
Where are we?
2649.
Oh, sorry. I think I was just. Oh, sorry. Yeah, you'll have to cut this out. My
Good.
bad. Oh yeah. Okay, yeah. So this play on words. So another thing you could consider is that the reason that the term fear of God is used here, and it's not by no means the only reason, but there is a little pun kind of going on here where the Pharaoh says to look upon the sons and daughters, which is a verb ra'ah, and then the midwives instead of ra'ahing the yareh, and then these verbs often will be used by biblical authors to kind of create a pun that because they sound very similar, and so that's probably part of what's going on. So that's just another reason that this could be happening, and that verb or word here at least could be used.
That's so cool. Okay, so we didn't actually see it in the clip, but in the actual series, Jonathan Pageau, I think it's Pageau. Okay,
Peugeot. It's French.
Jonathan
It's
Pageau.
Peugeot.
That's right. Okay, all right.
Yeah.
See, good thing you're here. So in the series, not in this clip, but in the series, Jonathan Pageau actually, kind of offers some pushback to Prager, where he says the midwives are Hebrew because the tyrant is trying to get women to kill their own men. It's essentially feminizing them. What do you think about that?
Yeah, and I'm pretty sure Peterson also makes a claim that the midwives are this whole story is a way of feminizing the Hebrews. I think they both kind of jump on that bus and head hard in one direction, and I mean literally it feminizes them because yeah, there's only now women, or they're aiming for only women, but that the text is speaking about demasculizing in some abstract sense, it's probably a bit off base. In the narrative, the removal of the males is a threat to the patriarchal promise of the seed, right? Abraham's seed. They have to have males for the seed line to continue forward. So that's the threat in, and the big overarching story. What the problem is here. So that the ability to bless the nations through Abraham's seed is being compromised or potentially wiped out. So that's kind of the focus of what's going on underneath in the story here. If you're following from Genesis, Exodus, and on, that's the problem with no males. I'm not sure how you could even say that the Hebrews are feminized when there are only women left, right? Because they're saying like it's the demasculizing, as though you're assuming a male who's being demasculized, or the removal of masculinity, but there are no males. So how is that referring to that? You get what I'm saying here? It's kind of like an idiosyncrasy or a problem in that approach. Peterson does later say that it might be to get rid of the opposition from men, so there's no brute force of the Israelites, which, yes, that's probably true and probably right. So those are a couple things at least to consider there.
Yes, I mean, in some ways, they are literally feminized because there are only feminine people left.
Yes.
But it's awesome. Okay, but of course, and to the conclusion, Prager responds by saying, "Oh, that's actually a good point. Maybe it's not actually clear. Maybe it's actually ambiguous on purpose." So it was interesting to see him change his mind so quickly. So later, they talk about how the story is ethic, not ethnic centered, in regards to God. Like God's concerned about the ethics of it, not the specific, ethnicity of the people. Do you have any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, that was a weird claim, especially, I'm not sure, I don't remember who made that. Ethic, not ethnic centered was the quote. The problem is that the Bible really is focused on one ethnic group, especially the Old Testament. Like you can't deny that. Others are included in the mix, of course. You have Gentiles coming in, but the thrust of the story is the Israelites, the descendants of Abraham, and ethnicity and into the Jews, and it's this focus on a people group, right? And so to say it's ethic, that the Bible is purely ethic and not ethnic centered, that doesn't make a lot of sense. It's God working with a particular ethnicity in an ethical way to bring about knowledge and salvation from him. But I think to say it's not ethnic centered is problematic, and probably for more than what I've just said. You can't Israelize the Old Testament. It's not a book full that's come from the sky of ethics. It is a story about a real people group, and you have to respect that people group because they lived through all of this stuff. And I would say you're getting close to really devaluing the Jewish heritage of the Hebrew Bible when you say stuff like that.
Yeah. hmm Yeah. So then they continue to talk about, this objective morality and evil, and how this story, relates to how we see evil. And Peterson and James Ward talked about how, the evolutionary ways of like how we got morality. Then they continued to Exodus 1:17-22, where it talks about Pharaoh getting mad at the midwives for not killing the babies. And then Pharaoh gives the command to throw all newborn boys into the Nile. And Prager makes a really interesting quote. He says that, it's special because it's the unimportant verse means so much, which is that the parents of Moses are unimportant. Like, it seems the way that he's portraying the story is that or the writer of Exodus is portraying the story is that the people of Moses' parents, like, they're not named, they're kind of unimportant, it seems like. And then Peterson claims the whole story with the midwives and putting Moses in the river is part of a lowly birth motif, like kind of like Superman is, where Superman, he has these great parents in this great fantastic world, and then he comes to Earth, and his parents are basically nobodies. And he claims that Peterson claims that there's nothing about the lineage of Moses that's fascinating. Can you talk about what your thoughts are on that one?
Yeah, and so again, we're in this kind of half-right territory, I think. But first off, to say that there's no lineage is not correct, because it says specifically that they're Levites. And so to say they're Levites you should be going ding, 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 priestly. So there's this priestly thing already being introduced. Now, whereas the Levitical line and this whole priestly system isn't set up yet, the narrator is giving you a clue here, and is saying, like, this is a priestly boy. So in one way, the boy is special. It's a Levitical boy, and so the narrator wants you to know that. But at the same time, the lowly birth motif, Superman is not your best example here. You can go back to the ancient Near East, and there are a lot of lowly birth motif stories circulating at the time. Whenever you consider Exodus to being written, there are lots of these stories. I think there are 38 of them or something crazy like that. A really good one, I think, that maybe gets around the time of when this story is being portrayed, particularly, maybe Ramses II or something like that around there, is the story of when Osiris and Set, they battle, and then Osiris's wife, she's pregnant. Osiris dies, and but then the wife hides the baby in a basket in the reeds of the Nile. So same thing that happens with Moses, right? Reeds, basket, Nile. The child's saved and then weaned by the mother, and that's emphasized. The weaning is emphasized in this Osiris, and so that this child is named Horus, by the way. And so the weaning is emphasized, that Horus is weaned. And then in Moses' story, what else is emphasized? The weaning, which is strange. Like, why is this emphasized? Because it's trying to riff on this, I think. I think it's a really good parallel that fits, and it's a really well-known story in Egypt. And then what's happening? And so again, to Peterson's point, when he's saying, Moses is a nobody, but who is Moses being portrayed as in this story? He's Horus. And who is Horus? Horus is the god of kingship, and you'll see in Egyptian artwork behind Pharaoh with the wings, saying, like, it's the symbolic picture of kingship, and it's the representation of the kingship of the Pharaoh. And so Moses is being portrayed as Horus, as in the king, but Pharaoh then in the picture and in the story is Set, who's the god of chaos and destruction. And so it's an ironic flipping, right? Moses is the king who has this priestly background, and Pharaoh is not being Pharaoh. He's not Horus empowered. He's actually Set empowered. He's bringing destruction, and so he's in the wrong spot. And so you've got this whole thing going on in the background, and someone in the ancient world would probably pick up on this, especially in an Egyptian context. So I think that's probably a better way at the abandoned child motif or something like that, or the story coming up from rags to riches kind of thing, than Superman.
Yeah, of course. That's really fascinating. Of course, Superman is kind of like known by people today, so that's, it's just to be clear for the audience, Joel is not saying that that is a bad reference, but we have even more specifics. Don't want people to
I'm not saying it's wrong. I said half right. Right? So, yeah, it's half right. He's getting at it, but there's more to it, and it would be just good for someone to fill that in, right?
Yeah, totally. Okay, so later it talks about, and they talk about in Exodus 2:2-3, the birth of Moses. The mother puts Moses in the basket. Prager mentions that the word for boat is the same word for Noah's Ark.
Yeah, and to their credit, and here's a really good one. They do have some points of sensitive exegesis, and here I think there is meant to be an analogy or a reference back to Noah's Ark when Moses is put in his own ark in the waters of salvation, and Noah is saved in the waters of waters of chaos, but he's protected, right? And so I do think you're supposed to see a new Noah figure in a sense here. And that's great that Prager pointed this out. Like, that's a gold star. Good.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so Peterson notes that Moses allied with the water, his origin is kind of this watery story. He has power over this wild structure. And then Pharaoh is allied with stone. He's firm, he's in place, and his picture of the story is Pharaoh is like stone compared to Moses, who uses water. Peterson, what do you think about that one?
Yeah, that's a strange kind of jump. And I wish someone would have pushed back at the table, because I know Pajot at least understands that waters, especially like the primeval or primordial waters, are a symbol of functionlessness. That's not a word, but or chaos or something like that, or not being in right order or something like that. And so that is true. The water imagery, the chaos water imagery is true, but the idea that Pharaoh is united with stone imagery or hardness, that's not in the text, nor is it in the ancient Near Eastern kind of symbolism. So I don't really know what's going on there. Moses' use of water is wielding the powers of chaos at the behest of Yahweh. So you see in the Noah story, the waters come, but Yahweh saves Moses, and you've got Moses and the waters parting and them going through and being saved also in the Nile. And so the water is this chaos that comes and destroys and decreates Egypt, just like the world was decreated in Genesis 6 and following. And so that's right. But the hardness motif, he just kind of, just because he sees water and then he goes, oh, there must be solid. And he just makes this leap, Peterson. And that's just not there, right? He's just making something up. He's just pulling that out of thin air, right? And I think it's better to see Pharaoh as a snake figure who needs to be crushed, which is reminiscent of the Genesis 3, this snake motif, this seed of the serpent, seed of this chaos monster, who will reappear throughout in shadows and veils and in various ways and in various guises. But I think you're supposed to see the first kind of big enemy, who is an embodiment of the snake, is Pharaoh. And if you consider the ancient context again, consider even just the uraeus on his forehead. What is it? Snake, right here, like right here. It was a sign of divine power. So when you look at Pharaoh, you see a snake. His face is a snake. And then even if you consider Ramses II, where I think maybe the story is being positioned to be around, in his temple complex, what do you see as you walk in? You could Google it. Google the images. 2 gigantic statues. And what is the most prominent thing on these statues? snake, Uraea's snake, right here. You see a snake pharaoh. And so, and even in their tombs, you find snakes on the walls, protective, images and figures. And so, the snake is actually the figure associated with water as well in the ancient Near East. So you got Leviathan and other names for these watery snake beasts and monsters and personifications of chaos and to its sense destruction or decreation. So then the question is that more of who Pharaoh is, especially because the snake water connection we find in the ancient Near East and the connection with Genesis. And I think that would be a better way to characterize Pharaoh rather than hard, because that's not anywhere in the text. But if you could see the ancient Near Eastern motif going on here, in a sense, actually, Pharaoh is watery, right? Peterson's saying he's not watery, but he actually is. He's the dragon in the sea, the twisting serpent who's in the sea, as I think Isaiah says. And so he's not hard. He's soft. He's water, but in a different way. So again, it's missing it because there's no one there engaging with the actual ancient Near Eastern imagery in this respect.
This will be edited, but you've said 54:30, or I would assume you said that. I don't know if I was just putting it in there or what, but it says Peterson says that to see his face and die has to do with being overwhelmed. Is that about seeing God's face?
Yeah, that's God's face. Yeah.
But isn't this part of the? We haven't really talked about how Moses goes and sees God, though, right?
He just says this in the thing. You can cut it out if you want.
Okay, all right. We'll end up talking about it anyways.
Yeah.
Okay. So then next we have the clip of the parallels between Noah, Moses, and the water. So let's watch that here.
And water is chaotic, right, from a symbolic perspective, and water is associated with what you immerse yourself in when you're baptized, and water is like the pre-cosmogonic chaos that exists at the beginning of time. And so for Moses to be a master of chaos and water is also to make him procedurally the antithesis of the tyrant, because the tyrant wants everything in stone and solid, and Moses is the antithesis of that.
And I think there's also the one thing that happens is you have an extreme. You have, let's say, the Pharaoh, and then you have water. And what happens is, what Moses is going to be doing through the entire story is making that mediation between what is above and what is below. And now you have this little image of the ark as being a little microcosm, which is what you see in Genesis, little microcosm of the world that exist in this extreme, right? Because in the flood, what you have is a return to the beginning, where now it's heaven and earth, and there's nothing in between. Like both of them can't sustain life. There has to be a hierarchy of reality that gets pulled out of the water, and that's what Moses is going to do. He's going to go up the mountain and bring down the law, and that is going to create that structure, that mediation between. Because even in the text, we'll see later, like God is also. Just God and the people doesn't seem to work, because God is constantly wanting to consume them. And it's like, no, don't consume them. So we need to have this mediation where being lays itself out and kind of falls down into the world in a way that is appropriate.
One of the things Jung said, and this is sort of relevant if you consider psychedelic experiences as well, which can be far more than...
You have any thoughts on that one?
Well, I mean, that's kind of a lot of what we already covered, that he makes this stone reference to Pharaoh, which doesn't really make sense given the ancient Near Eastern context, and it's kind of a leap. Although Pageau gets good stuff, and Peterson does point out like the primordial water chaos and stuff like that. It's just taking the image and applying it to the wrong characters in a sense, or just misapplying it, I think, in this case.
Then people can tolerate. Jung said part of the purpose of religious practice was to stop people from having religious experiences. And because he was very interested in experiences that were extreme enough to border on psychosis, for example, and that if you don't have those intermediary structures between you and the absolutely transcendent, which might be reality itself in the ethical and material sense, then that's just too much. And you do see that echoed in motifs like the burning bush, where God tells Moses later not to look at him directly, at best to look at his back, right? Because you just can't withstand that direct contact with something that exceeds your comprehension in every dimension simultaneously, no matter how good it is, no matter
Yeah, so he talks about how when Moses he's looking in the storm. We'll get into this later, but Moses can't look at God because I guess it's just too much for him. Do you have any sentiment with that idea, and any disagreements at all?
Yeah, I mean, again, it's probably a half truth in that, okay, God's unmitigated presence is overwhelming or something like that is what he's getting at. Which, yeah, the question would be then, why is it overwhelming? Because in the story itself, it seems to be that it's humans, like kind of deathly unclean state, their immoral state. That's why God, especially because this is in the golden calf incident when that story happens. It's just after a couple chapters later, and so it seems to be in the face of rebellion, you will not see God's face and live. It's actually a play on a scene earlier where Pharaoh says that you will not see my face again, Moses, and live. And so it's almost like God is saying, as the true king, the true Pharaoh, uh, people can't enter my presence and live because they've done because of what they've done. You're not entering into this and seeing me. And so maybe there's like this kind of mystic element of not of overwhelmingness of the presence of God, but I think it needs to be characterized in the narrative as something more of because of the fallenness of Israel and of people.
That makes sense. Okay, so later they talk about Exodus 2:4-6, where Pharaoh's daughter picks up Moses from the basket in the Nile. Peterson notes that there's genuine compassion for the infant, which is seems to be the opposite of what Pharaoh is doing in the story. He notes that Pharaoh's daughter is antithetical to the stone, like Pharaoh. Do you agree with that sentiment?
I mean, we're just hitting the same thing again here, right? That she's antithetical to him in his actions, but she's not water-like. Stone water, that contrast is just not there. There's a literary motif that is there of daughters and women saving and birthing the nation. So there's that really cool thing. There's actually 7 women in Exodus who save Israel, and that whole promise to bless the world. And they're the unexpected people to save the day. So that's there. But I'm not quite sure the stone water thing is.
Yeah, that 7 thing's really fascinating because Tim Mackey notes that there's a billion parallels between the Exodus story and the Genesis story with creation in the garden and all that, and how it's the writer of Exodus is just really making us think about how what happened in Genesis. And of course in Genesis you have Eve, who is almost messing things up, but then you have the women in this story that are making things right, essentially. Any thoughts on that one?
Well, yeah, I mean, even the writer of Exodus couldn't be more. Well, I mean, you could be more clear and say this is Genesis, but besides that, you have this line. She saw that he was good to Moses after referring to this priestly child. So it's like this whole priest world, which is Genesis 1 and 2, in my opinion, and then saw that it was good, which is the same language as Genesis 1, the seeing that was good, right? And so you're getting these, hey, pay attention. This is we're riffing on Genesis here, and so the 7 also riffing on the 7s there, and so yeah, absolutely.
But also, doesn't it say that the daughter or one of the women, they saw that it was good, and then they take it just like Eve does with the fruit and the taking?
I actually don't know if the word lakach is used there, which I think is the word that's used with Eve. So it might be a different word, but you would expect lakach if it were a direct parallel.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so yeah, so there's once again there's a motif of the orphan and Superman. Then James Orr mentions that all heroes are women in this story. It seems like it's a feminine compassion in the right place. It has true maternal values or virtues. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, all the hero are women, 100%. Yeah, they are. That's the point of the women in these stories, that they're birthing and saving the nation, right? It's good. I'm not sure if it's trying to get at this kind of abstract feminine compassion in the right place, true maternal virtues. I wonder if it's more the marginalized or those who are viewed as less than in society being the ones who truly save the day and who are the driving force of change, which is a common theme. And even Israel being a small one among the nations, being a light to the world, right? This nobody being the somebody who brings about change, and that's a common theme in the Bible. So I wonder if it's more about that than true maternal virtues.
Yeah. And Peterson notes something really, really fascinating to me. He says, the Gentiles have the law written on their hearts as universal knowledge of morality. What do you think about that one?
Yeah, I mean, we're getting in the New Testament here because he's quoting Paul in Romans. Yeah, I mean, some people take that interpretive angle on that passage, but there's a pretty big push in New Testament studies to say that well, I mean, again, it's Paul. Every line, every accent is debated in Paul and to no end. But another way of taking this is that because Paul's point of the letter is Jewish Gentile relations, and he kind of masks his interlocutors at the beginning. It's somebody having the law written on their heart, a Gentile with the law written on their heart. I think he's actually referring to Christians, those who have the Spirit, and he's going to get there in the flow of the argument eventually. So he's kind of hiding some of his cards, and he'll reveal them as he goes on. So that's another way of taking that. So again, it's just taking a verse and saying this is what it means, when there really is a lot to consider, because this is a hugely debated subject, especially in Paul.
All right. Okay, so Exodus 2, 7 and 10, they talk about how Pharaoh's daughter has Moses' mother nurse him, which is something really interesting about it. Prager mentions that the passage speaks incredibly because Moses' Israelite mom is not the biological mother, according to later Jewish tradition. The relationship is that what we learn from our pagan counterparts, but Moses chooses allegiance. Um, do you see any? Do you have any thoughts on like whether it's the actual Moses' mom or it's Egyptian, or that do you actually know if it's the actual biological mother that takes care of Moses in that story?
I'm not sure. I haven't thought much about that.
Okay, all right. So Jonathan Pageau, he talks about the relationship is what we learn from pagan counterparts, but Moses chooses allegiance. Peterson notes that Moses takes what is his relationship and overthrows it. Or in Peterson talk about the code written on our hearts again. Stephen Blackwood talks about he's actually, it's 1 hour in and it's his first comment outside of the intro. And then they get to Exodus 2, 11, 15, and Pageau mentions how the Moses kills the Egyptian, which is the goal to beat Egyptian, but misses the part where he gets side of Hebrews. You basically saying that you can't do it without God. Any thoughts on that one?
Yeah. I mean, they go on to say that Moses kills, but he doesn't have the authority from God to do it. And I think this is another one of those half rights. He does kill, and I think probably in a bad way here, and we'll get to that later as I think Prager brings it up. But the point of the story is that it's pointing to the law to come, and Moses isn't following the law here. He's killing with premeditation. He's looking both ways for a smaller crime than the law will allow. And so this person, it just says, is hitting an Israelite, yet Moses murders them for hitting. Whereas in Exodus, in 21:19, you're going to see striking would not have the consequence of the death penalty, just a strike on a free. I guess there are some. I guess you could get into the weeds of whether it's slave-free relations, but even still, the death penalty probably wouldn't happen here just for striking. And so Moses is actually going up beyond the morality of the law that's to come. So I don't think that he doesn't have authority to kill, but he should have killed is the right answer here in the narrative structure of Exodus.
Okay, so later Prager talks about how the biblical view of leadership is not of perfection, that everyone fails. And I think that's definitely really smart there in regards to, whenever you think of the story of the Bible, everyone makes mistakes except for Jesus. And that's really something to meditate on, I think.
Yeah.
I don't know who this was, but one of them talks about how hot and cold in Revelation refers to good and bad. Do you know anything about that one?
Oh yeah, it's Peterson. I cringed at this one. Okay. He says that when Jesus talks to the church in Laodicea, I wish that you were either hot or cold, but because you're lukewarm, I'm going to spit you out of my mouth. That's what Jesus says. And Peterson says, oh, it's you should either be righteous or evil. Jesus wants you to pick a side. And he connects this to like being adventurous. Like you got to be adventurous somehow. And God's like on the edge of like, he's in this like kind of gritty, edgy, be good or bad. You could be bad and be adventurous. Like that. That's what he's getting at. That's not what it means in Revelation. He's talking to the church in Laodicea, and he's talking about, there's a reference there to their water systems where they have infamously lukewarm water, and it's not useful. And so they have to have their systems had to be updated and changed to have either hot or cold. That's useful water is hot cold water and cold water. Not useful water is lukewarm. So that's the point. So it's not saying good or bad is good. It's saying don't be useless, as in lukewarm. And so it's just missing the entire backdrop of what's going on in that passage. And it's actually, that's one of the, I'd say like Bible college first class mistakes that people make on that one, which you hear a lot. And it's just, again, pointing out, I'm not trying to be rude, just that they should have had somebody here who could check these things. Because now Peterson has a huge audience. People are going to listen to this and go, oh, hot or cold? I should be good or I should be bad. Like it's even okay to be bad. God just doesn't want me to be apathetic or whatever. It's like, well, no, it's not saying that. He's saying be good, as in be useful, hot or cold. Don't be useless. So it's not saying be bad at all. Yeah. So
yeah,
one of those issues.
I was just gonna say, I think everyone who spent more than 15 minutes in church has probably heard that interpretation.
Yeah.
All right. So Blackwood, Stephen Blackwood mentions that Moses is a weak figure in the story. Prager mentions that the transformation of Moses from weak to divine. Prager mentions that Abraham, he knows nothing about God before the story. Moses, he knows for Abraham, we know nothing about him before God comes onto the scene and talks to Abraham. And it's a little bit different with Moses, where we know a lot of his backstory. We know his parents. We know his getting out of the water. It's interesting little mixing of the stories. What do you think about that one?
Yeah. Well, Prager says that he's an impressive person, and no one's going to say, why did God choose him? Because they're going to say, obviously God would choose him because he's impressive. I think that's painting probably with too broad of strokes and too rose-colored glasses of Moses. I mean, the guy kills an Egyptian illegally against the law. He complains about talking. He doesn't circumcise his son, and God comes to kill him for it. He strikes the rock, and God is going to kill him for that, or he judges him for that, I should say. In the golden calf, I think you can make an argument, acts in severe rage, even though God just forgave the people in a sense. And he can't enter the promised land in the end. So could you say obviously God would choose him? I'm not sure. There's impressive aspects of his character. He's bold. He's got faith. He gets concerned for the Israelites and all that. But I'm not, I think like a lot of characters, they're complex and they have foibles and they do wrong things. And that's supposed to be part of the charm, that we're like that too. And God uses us too, should we take the step to follow.
Yeah, totally. And it's really fascinating that, and we see this in the New Testament where Moses is, I wouldn't say deified, but he's pretty close to it, where he's seen as this huge figure for them. But we also see a lot of really bad things that he does. And in a lot of ways, he's not the the leader that he should be. And it's really interesting to see the contrast. I wonder if Prager, because I guess he is a Jew, or an Israelite, or at least. So I wonder if that maybe is influencing his way of seeing him in the story. That's just speculation.
It's very possible. It's very possible. Yeah.
So Exodus 2:16-22 explains how Moses met his future wife. Prager mentions that Hebrews always meet their wives at wells, and that water has cosmic significance. So I really like this one. This is really, really fascinating to me, because I would not have seen a well as, craziness, but at the same time, it does seem a lot that would in the Bible and the Old Testament that, it seems like they met their wives at wells, and that it's the narrator is pointing that out because it's a very interesting significance of water, and as he says, cosmic significance. Do you have any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, well, I mean, the God in Genesis and in Eden, he's responsible for the waters that spread out from Eden and water the whole world. And these waters are living waters. They're sweet water, the water that gives life, right? Not salt water that will kill. And so that there are wells coming up from and there's water bubbling up from under the earth, I think is a sign of divine favor. And so wells in themselves are almost kind of this portrait back to Eden of the waters that give life to the world and give water in a hard place kind of thing. And so in that way it has a cosmic significance. So I think that's interesting and good. And I think Pageau sometimes points out these good kind of connections to the Eden narrative.
Yeah, that's really cool. I like that. Okay, so Exodus 2:16-22, they talk about how Moses, I already talked about that. Exodus 2:23-5, they talk about how God was concerned with the Israelites' pain. Peterson mentions how God remembered the covenant that Abraham made with the, to his descendants and all that kind of stuff. Someone mentions that would Israelites remember to be moral? I don't remember what the context of that one was.
It's just an interesting question though, because they don't have a system of morality. So just a thought, why would they remember that when they don't, like, what does that mean? But anyways.
Yeah, that's really interesting to think about. Because they didn't have a law at this time of the story.
Yeah.
But then you also get into Abraham as he was considered righteous, and how all that works is an interesting conversation. So someone mentions that they assumed that Yahweh's name was known before the 400 years. Can you talk about that one?
Yeah, that's again a red flag, because as soon as you say, oh, they knew the Yahweh's name before the Exodus, you are showing you're not aware of a gigantic discussion in biblical studies, and especially with Exodus and the Pentateuch. It's contested because we have this verse in Exodus 6:3 where it says, God says, I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob as God, El Shaddai, but my name Yahweh, but by my name Yahweh, I was not known to them. So it seems like the text is saying that Yahweh wasn't known 400 years ago. So you're saying he was known, but the text is saying he might not have been known. And so they don't seem to be aware of this. And it's also problematic because it's again entering into this discussion of biblical studies. Why is Yahweh's name, which is in the patriarchal narratives, but why is the Exodus writer saying Yahweh wasn't known by that name? Is it anachronistic in that it's being written back in time, so they're just writing the name of Yahweh in the patriarchal narratives, even though they didn't use that name? Is it a later editor who comes in? It's like, oh no, but Yahweh, yeah, this was Yahweh. Like that's an option too. Again, these are debated. And there's a question that is the verse even translated correctly? Exodus 6:3. A case has been made recently, I think in the 90s, and then it's being brought up again by modern commentators. Carmen Imes takes this position. Searles takes this position. Alexander takes this position. Originally, it's from Anderson Forbes, from that edition, the person who wrote that edition of the Hebrew Bible. And they translate it as, I am Yahweh, I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as El Shaddai, and my name is Yahweh. Did I not make myself known to them? And so then that actually changes how you understand why the divine name appeared in the patriarchal narratives, because he did make his name known by that name. And so it's a debate, but they're not aware of this debate, and you have to be aware of it because it's huge. And it really, a lot of it is it shows some of your presuppositions for the Pentateuch, source criticism, all these things, how you are approaching the text, your methodology, and you need to be aware of the various methodologies that come into Pentateuchal studies. And they don't seem to have any knowledge of it, which is again a red flag.
Yeah, that makes sense. So Prager mentions how he asked the question. It's funny. I love Prager in this series. He's got some really interesting insights, but also sometimes he just asks questions. He's just like, yeah, so why did God leave the Jews in Europe if he was willing to take them out of Egypt? And they talk about different solutions to that. And Peterson says man has to reach to God first. Prager says, God saves people groups, but not individuals. Prager mentions the problem of evil. God created evil to do good, but he says he doesn't accept that, and but he says that his solution, is free will, is the cause of evil. Later they talk about Exodus 3:1-2. God appears to Moses in a burning bush. The group, they see it. Basically the whole group was basically saying that it's purifying oneself before experiencing God, because Moses has to take off his shoes, right? Yeah, I'm not seeing that. Maybe I'll cut that out. Whatever. Do you know what that context was?
I don't remember now.
No, that's okay. All right. So Peterson says that Moses is serving Jethro, which means that he is outside of the Hebrew and Egyptian ethical systems. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, again, a big claim. Because he goes to Midian and serves Jethro, that means he's not within Egyptian or Hebrew ethical systems. Well, you need to ask the question, were Hebrew and Egyptian ethical systems at the time of the story different? I would argue no, because they've been in Egypt for a long time. And then are Midianites different than Egyptians? But Midian is near to Egypt. Midian is, I don't know, 100 miles or something. It's like a week or so, depending how you're traveling. And then is there truly different ethical systems that close together? And I would argue that's tough to substantiate, especially because we have ancient Near Eastern law codes from various regions, much further, closer than Midian, these kinds of things, all the way up to like Hammurabi's law code and stuff like that. And there's a lot of overlap in ethical systems, right? And so to say going to Midian and being under Jethro means you're outside of Egyptian ethical systems, I think it's betraying a lack of knowledge of ancient Near Eastern ethics, how their societies were often very similar to each other, which we see a lot in the Bible, of borrowing and sharing either into symbolism, motifs, and even ethical things. A lot of the laws in the Covenant Code in chapters 21 and 23 share affinities with things like Hammurabi's code. And so it's a stretch, right? And part of the problem is that he doesn't realize that Yahwism, the worship of Yahweh, might have come from Midian, which is the Hebrew kind of at least religious system, right? There's a claim of it's kind of this Yahweh from the south tradition, and you see it in Judges where it says Yahweh came from from Seir, from Edom. Then in Deuteronomy it says he comes from Seir, again from Mount Paran. And then in Habakkuk, he says the Holy One comes from Mount Paran. And if you look at these locations, those are all places in Midian, like the southern part of the south of Israel. And then we actually have inscriptional evidence, a couple texts that I believe they're Egyptian texts from the 14th and 13th century BCE, where Yahweh is connected with not Israelites, but with, again, this area of Midian, the southern Edom kind of region, and he's called Yahu in the land of the Shasu Bedouins. And so you see Yahweh as a name, it appears, it seems at least, before Israel as a nation in this area where Jethro is worshiping. And it's very possible, and some people make the claim, that Yahwism comes from Midian and from Moses's travels here, which directly connects then the religion of the Israelites with the religion of the Midianites, or at least the deity of the Midianites, I should say, at the time. And so there's like a lot of overlap here, that to say that the Midianites it's a different ethical system and different completely than Egypt or the Hebrews, it's just again, not an informed claim.
Yeah, it's completely the opposite of the point they're making, is that instead of being outside of the Israelite system by, talking with this priest, he's actually might even been inside of it even more.
Yeah.
That's super interesting. But of course, also that you mentioned the Israelite. A lot of the codes we see in the Israelite law code, are we also see in some Egyptian texts and Babylonian texts. So it seems like there's also a cultural aspect here.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. So let's see here. Jonathan Pajou. Am I getting it right? Pajou.
Peugeot, yeah.
Pajou. All right. Jonathan Pajou. He talks about how God remembers the covenant, and he gives these people. He says that the tabernacle is a representation of Mountain of Eden and Mountain on Sinai, which is super fascinating to think about. The burning bush is he says it's a bramble bush, which means fullness of everything. Which is a reference to the thorns before the fall, and the thorn bush is full of light. I guess that's God, and it's a bush that never burns up, even though it's part of this world. Let's see, and then they say for the first time since Noah, God remembers. Like, is that? What do you think about that one?
Well, I mean, just on a technical, just as a technical point, it's not the first time that God remembers since Noah. In Genesis 19, God remembers Abraham. It says he remembered Abraham. And then in Genesis 30, it says that he remembers Rachel. So technically inaccurate, but that's a quibble. I don't want to go beyond that.
Yeah, but
what is interesting?
Also,
Go ahead.
Go for it. No, you.
Oh, just that you said that he comments on the Sinai, Tabernacle, Eden connection, the cosmic mountain stuff. That's great. I think Peugeot is really on point there.
Yeah, that's definitely one of his pros and what I like about him. So Peterson, he talks about taking off shoes meant to approach the transcendent, because he's taking off his shoes before he's, I guess, in the presence of God. And Peterson says it's a sign of humility. Moses, in Exodus 3:2-5 says Moses tries to find out why the bush is on fire, and he finds out that the bush is actually God. Prager says that God says, take off the shoes from feet, which is redundant. Peterson makes a note that Moses stands there naked, that the shoes elevate him from the ground, which is a lack of humility, and that's why he needs to take them off. What are your thoughts on this whole shoe thing and the presence of God and all that?
Yeah, I mean, again, it's just it's taking stabs at things, but you're taking those stabs in the dark because there's no other information coming in. It's just, oh, it seems like this. Oh, it could be this, right? And Peterson actually makes another claim. He says that taking off shoes means that there was no claim to land. That was actually a big point he makes. That's problematic. He also says that taking the shoes off is going, or I think maybe this is Peugeot, that taking the shoes off is going back to Eden and removing the garments of skin. So those are also claims they make about the feet and the shoes. When it comes to the claim that the taking off shoes means no claim to land, I don't know what he's talking about. I tried looking that up. I couldn't find anything. I thought maybe I'm uninformed here. I think he's just making that up, or he heard it somewhere, or he's misremembering, or I don't know. But again, someone might now go, oh, that's what that means. Got it, because Peterson said it, right? So that's a bit of an issue. When it comes to taking off the shoes and it being Edenic, there might be a connection there, and I feel like they stumbled on it accidentally. Again, like some of the things, because you can be right in bit like there's no. The ivory tower is not the only place where meaning is found, and you can get things right just reading the Bible, right? But it's helpful to have people who spend their lives studying this stuff to try and really hone in again that hermeneutical spiral. And so this is a place where they could have other things to buttress their opinion. And so what's interesting is that priests might have ministered without shoes. That might have been part of the theological drama of the tabernacle, that the barefoot aspect was meant to go back to the Edenic state. In Exodus 28, they don't prescribe footwear to the priests, and they require other places require the priest to wash their feet in Exodus. And I believe other Jewish traditions say that you couldn't wear shoes on the Second Temple Mount. This is found elsewhere in world religions as well. One explanation is that you wouldn't want to track dirt into the temple, which is possible. But it's also you could also consider that ancient Egyptians removed their shoes before social superiors, and that the removal having bare feet symbolized humility and mortification in ancient Israel. And you can see that in places like 2 Samuel 15:30, Isaiah 22. So it could be that it's more of like a sign of humility, which they're getting at, which is right. And it could be that there's this Edenic thing. It also could be that there's a ritual uncleanness because you're wearing potentially leathers of dead animals, which might contaminate holy ground in like the temple imagery. So the land claim, no. The Eden parallel, potentially, since the tabernacle is a theological drama of Eden, in my opinion.
Yeah, I wonder if that whole shoe thing, they got that connection because, I mean, at least my family growing up, we take our shoes off before we go into the house so we don't get the stuff dirty. I wonder if they're kind of getting at that, and then actually maybe even possibly getting at something like an actual real point the story or the context is making, almost like through our American context that still does a little bit of the same thing maybe. So Prager says that you have to remove the garment of skin, return to Eden. He also said, what a crazy mystery to see a burning bush, which is definitely true. He mentions that, the mystery is that we're all naked. And Prager, he says that he asked the question, do people reject God because they're afraid to accept nakedness, which is like a lack of humility? And they talk about that, and they talk about dealing with death. Do we really know people before they've been tested by life? Which is a really interesting question. Peterson talks about maybe the evil in the world because we are not all we can be. Then they talk about all the manifestations of the law must reveal themselves. Peterson thinks that is said to Moses or maybe in the Gospels. Could you talk about that one?
Yeah, all the manifestations of the law must reveal themselves. And he says that's from the Bible. I just don't remember where is what he says. Yeah, it just doesn't exist. Like I tried thinking about it. That's not a verse. That's not a paraphrase. All the manifestations of the law must reveal themselves. What is a manifestation of the law? How do they manifest themselves? I don't know. I don't know where he's getting that from. It's just one of those kind of pulled out of the thin air, I think, and I don't know.
He talks about the devil tempting Job. Do you have thoughts on that one?
Yeah, well, it's just again being unaware of other discussions related to the Satan figure. So it's debated. Who is it? The devil, like capital S Satan? I mean, Job is written quite late, and so it has a bunch of later Hebrew and some Aramaic stuff. And so a pure Satan figure, considering that idea of capital S Satan, that name seems to be coming to play later on in Jewish history and in the Bible and in Second Temple materials. So yes, that's possible, but it's also possible that we have a member of the divine council here, and this is kind of like an accuser angel. So there's a lot more to it than just saying Satan tested Job, capital S Satan. But again, it's just an unawareness of what's going on, it seems.
I don't blame him for that one. That's very common in, at least Protestant culture, at least I think that.
I'll take it. I'll take the hit there and say I'm being too nitpicky.
No. You little gooper. Anyway, so it talks about the book of Exodus is the neurobiology of happiness. Where there is no vision, people perish. Thoughts?
Yeah, I don't know. I'm not a neurobiologist, so I don't know. But is that what Exodus is? And when you just say there is no vision, people perish, you have to finish the verse. It says, when there's no prophecy, the people cast off restraint. But as for he who guards Torah, happiness is his. So if Exodus is a path to happiness, it's not just like this abstract neurobiological thing. It's the book points to a covenant with God, his care, his instruction, his mediated presence, and that's the way to happiness. It's not just, as Peterson will often say, have a high aim and aim for the best in life, and then what you think is good and go for it. That's not, because it's he who guards Torah. Happiness is his. So it's a constrained goal, right? And so I think it's just I mean, the neurobiological stuff, interesting, but is that how Exodus envisions it, just as highest aim? Go for that? I don't think so.
Yeah, well, that really gets into uh, a big question that you and I were both asking this as we were watching this, is because, Peterson gets actually a lot of hate for uh, archetypally or allegorically interpreting the Bible, and specifically in a series in Genesis, got a lot of hate for that. In my regards, I'm like, in some regards, it's like, okay, he's trying to make the text applicable to us, and it's is that not what the reason the text was written? Maybe is like a history part, but also like to teach us and guide us through life. Um, like, does that mean that it's bad to think of the Bible in these allegorical terms? What do you think?
Well, if I were to say allegory is wrong, a lot of the Christian tradition and ways of interpreting over many centuries in different communities, I would be condemning, and I don't want to do that. I think that the goal, especially in the modern context, should be as close as we can get, as close as we can to what the text is trying to convey. Not everybody has had the tools we have to understand the biblical text. And since we have these tools, we should be responsible and try to really get at meaning in this blessed context we have, the scientific world, the world of texts, of the internet, of scholarship. And so, yes, you could, and people do take things allegorically, and people do miss the what the text is getting at, and yet God still speaks, and that's good. And I'm not going to condemn that, and I'm not going to speak against that. But it's just that Peterson has such a high profile, and that he is claiming expertise here, and not in maybe him, but the group. So then to present things in allegorical ways, or ways that are outside of, or at least further from what the text is probably conveying, or getting closer to what the text is conveying, then it's irresponsible in a sense, because it's misinforming a bigger group of people than your 200 congregants on Sunday. And so I think it's just a higher standard for Peterson that he should be held to. And for this kind of thing, have someone who's a biblical scholar on your roundtable, because you're giving information that people will carry with them for the rest of their lives, and just a worldwide audience. But again, it's okay to miss the text. It's okay for people who have brought allegorical interpretations. It's okay, and we're all finite. We all miss things, but it's more of just a responsibility thing, I think, for this context of Peterson's debate.
Well, that's a really fascinating. Yeah, that's a really fascinating perspective. That's really interesting to think about. We'll have to keep continuing that conversation as we go through the rest of the series here. So,
Sure.
then they get to the part of the story where Exodus 3:5-6, where Moses hides his face before God. Peterson reminded that taking off the shoes is a lack of pride. They talk about Jesus said that meek shall inherit the earth. It has to be about pride. Prager says that's the best explanation ever. Peterson says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit," means that those who have been low enough to be ready to receive. Thoughts on that one?
Yeah, blessed are the poor in spirit means that those who have been brought low enough are ready to receive. Well, he doesn't finish the phrase, right? Blessed are the poor in spirit, because theirs is the kingdom of heaven. So it's an interesting take, but it means, I think, that those who are humble, who have been humbled inside, can engage in God's rule. It's the kingdom, right? So it's not, what does he receive? What is my question for him? Receive what? Receive like, what are you talking about? Or he doesn't actually say, right? But the text is specific to the kingship of God, especially as now mediated in Christ, and which is a very specific way of receiving, and a very specific person to receive, and a very specific path, rather than this kind of nebulous receive. Also, blessed, I think, what that means is it's like living the right life, in the sense of following the wise path, the blessed life, like kind of in a philosophical sense, like what is the right way to live. Actually, a New Testament scholar, Jonathan Pennington, in his Jesus the Great Philosopher, which is a 2020 work, made a really good case for that's how you understand blessed, like this right path, and in the wisdom, kind of the sagacious path of life. So I think, again, he's got to finish his Bible verses. Don't quote half.
Awesome. Okay, so this has been a lot of fun going through the topic. I hope you guys really enjoyed this. This has been, go check out Dr. Korytko's work in the description. He's got some interesting writings on the Exodus and the Septuagint. And I hope you guys really enjoyed this. Make sure to check out the next one where we go to part 2 of the series. This is what your pastor didn't tell you.